Our intention for these events is to provide a space where we can kind of discuss, challenge, and also listen to some of the most pressing issues that we need to interrogate to put global responsibility at the heart of engineering. As I'm sure you on the call already know, engineering has played a significant role, both good and bad, in getting humankind and the planet to where we are today. And now we must urgently tackle the numerous global challenges if we want to ensure a safe and just future for all. And part of this interrogation is the need for a rapid move towards global responsible practice within engineering. And this means critically reflecting on the role of engineering in society, understanding the social and environmental impacts, the economic impacts of engineering, both at a local and global scale. We need to move from an approach where engineering is kind of looking at people and planet to an approach where engineering is with people and planet. And Engineers Without Borders UK recently launched our principles of globally responsible engineering. And these principles is what we're going to be looking at through this series. Today, we're going to be looking at the first principle, which is responsible. And these principles are what we'd like to see the engineering community adopt to embed the culture of globally responsible engineering. We want to see this both in practice and also how it's taught. So it's really embedded in our culture. And during our conversation today, we're going to be unpacking the responsible principle, and in the coming weeks and months, we'll be unpacking the different principles as we go on. So today's session, what we're going to be doing is first just looking at those principles, just so you know what all of them are. Looking at the responsible one, that we'll be talking a lot more in depth today. We have a discussion with some panelists that have very kindly agreed to be part of this conversation, so giving their insights, providing their experiences, both the success stories and the challenges that they've experienced so far. And then following that discussion, we will have an opportunity to hear from one another during an interactive breakout session where together we'll learn how to embed responsibility into our day-to-day practice. So that's what we're doing today. Now, let's have a little look at what these principles are. So, as I mentioned, we recently launched these principles as part of our 2021-2030 strategy. And these key principles are what we'd like to see engineering as an industry do to adopt to put global responsibility at the heart. So we've got the first one, which is responsible. So this is to meet the needs of everyone within the limits of our planet. And we want this to be at the heart of engineering. Our second principle is purposeful, to consider all the influences and the impacts of our engineering from a project's or product's inception to its end of its life. And this should be at both a global and local scale for people and planet. Our third principle is to be inclusive, to ensure that our diverse viewpoints and knowledge are heard, included and respected in the engineering process. And our fourth and final principle is regenerative, to actively restore and regenerate ecological systems rather than just reducing impact. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at one of these principles today and kind of really diving into what does that mean in kind of different disciplines and different areas of work. So we're going to be looking at the responsible principle, which is to meet the needs of all people within the limits of our planet, and this being at the heart of engineering. And to help us digest this a little bit further, what we've been doing at Engineers Without Borders UK is kind of looking at, well, what are the actions that people can take to start using this principle within the day-to-day practice? So one of the actions that we're asking people to do is to, first of all, grow your understanding of globally responsible engineering. that could be by coming to events like this, where we get to hear from others of how they're approaching global responsibility in their practice, speaking to others of the peers, and to increase that knowledge. And then once we've increased that knowledge, once we feel like we've started to have an understanding, the next action that we're asking people to do is to facilitate conversations with others, to inspire our peers, our colleagues, to also engage in global responsible engineering. And today, of course, we're going to be hearing from our panelists to hear what's their approaches and how do they have these kind of conversations. And like I said, following that panel discussion, we'll be breaking into some small discussion groups ourselves to help you discuss this further, kind of share your experiences, your challenges, and hopefully inspire each other as we go. So joining us on the call, we've got 4 fantastic panelists who are going to be sharing their experiences. So starting off with Dr. Mazid Raid Saeed, who is a geoenvironmental engineer who's currently a research associate at Cardiff University at the School of Engineering. And Muaz is one of the areas that Muaz is currently researching is self-healing engineering materials. And he's particularly passionate about utilising biotechnology and natural inspired solutions to civil and environmental engineering problems. So fantastic to have Muaz on the call today. We've also got Webke. Webke is a PhD candidate at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. She is researching the system architecture for trustworthy edge intelligence with the goal of developing deeply personal and completely private voice assets for smart health. Living and gender-based violence mitigation applications. And prior to this PhD, Webke also co-founded and worked as a CEO at Engineers Without Borders South Africa. So fantastic to have Webke with us. We've also got Chris Hughes, who studied at the University of Birmingham, where he was driven by an interest for renewable energies, seeking a wider holistic perspective on engineering. And he joined Engineers Without Borders UK, the chapter at the University of Birmingham, where he took on a post-social secretary and the president role. And since graduating, he's worked directly with the UK heritage sector to tackle energy efficiencies challenging in the National Trust properties. And finally, we have Jonathan, who is a structural engineer and co-founder of Dash, an integrated architecture and engineering studio in London that focuses on sustainable design and responsible construction. He works with homeowners and developers to deliver sustainable residential developments. He has almost a decade of experience in construction, has worked internationally on projects in Singapore, Germany, Nigeria, and here in the United Kingdom. So it's fantastic to have our panelists with us today. I'll just close down that slide so we can say hello to our panelists. Hopefully you can all see them now. Excellent. Fantastic, thanks everybody. So to kick us off to the panel, oh, and I should say, sorry, please do use the chat to ask our panelists questions as we go along. Definitely encourage you to use that. But to kick us off, what does global responsibility mean to you and your practice, your work? It's a big question to kick us off with. Does anybody want to go first?
Okay.
Sure, go for it, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah. To me, I think the main thing about giving you some sort of sense of perspective, I think, particularly in engineering, you can get very focused on the technical aspects, whereas really when you're working on an engineering project, you're not just creating a single outcome, you're building a structure or an environment or something that's going to have to function for the people that use it. Not only function for the people who use it, but potentially people who use it in the future, whose needs might change. And then also that's going to have an impact on the environment around you. So you're not just building something, you're building something which is going to have an impact on the world for the whole lifetime, up until the point where you take down that structure or building. So it's about having some sort of perspective, taking a step back and thinking this isn't just whack it up and it will last 20 years. Likelihood it will be around for a lot longer. I mean, my perspective as a building services engineer is very much the energy use of a building. And as we know, carbon emissions are a big issue for climate change. And we're still putting in really inefficient fossil fuel systems that are going to have an impact around the other side of the world, not just in the place that you're installing it in the UK.
Thanks, Chris. I wonder if, Muaz, maybe you have a slightly different perspective, given that your work is quite in a different area. What does global responsibility mean for you and your work?
So thanks, Carrie. I think I agree with Chris. I've got a bit of a helicopter view of global responsibility. So for me, I think, the strategy lays it out very well. So it's a slight modification, but for me, it means that obviously meeting the needs and necessities of everyone, but without exceeding our planetary boundaries. And where we have exceeded them, to actively come back to acceptable levels. And one of the examples of that might be, the biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. So working together to do that, but in doing so, not to disadvantage any sort of communities that are on Earth. For instance, a good example of that might be waste, where developed countries might export certain waste fractions to other developing countries and sort of adding to their workload. So really sort of having that ethical perspective to it as well. And I suppose that then gets you to think about the problem from a wider lens, that how do we do that? How do we meet everyone's needs without crossing these very important planetary boundaries? Which then leads you to think that we should be working across disciplines, with economists, with people who are making legislation, informing public policy, and obviously the local communities where we are doing these projects, to really understand the problems that they're facing, and really to address those. So that would be my perspective on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Muaz. And kind of perhaps like unpacking that a little bit further, how does global responsibility kind of impact the decisions you make in your kind of day-to-day practice? I wonder, Jonathan, kind of giving your experience, your work, how does it make the decision process? How do you embed it into it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Carrie. I think it's just having a wider perspective on some of the issues we sort of look at. I mean, it can look like we have a very sort of like localized idea of responsibility because we're building, say, a home for someone, right? But there's so many knock-on effects that can have to the community, to the environment. And it's just about understanding that. Muaz made a great point about waste, for example. Like there's so much waste being generated, and not thinking about where that waste is going to end up just doesn't give you that sort of responsibility. So sometimes what we try to do is we try to look at the global, the sort of global responsibility perspective and say, we need to reduce waste. We need to deal with issues of reducing water. There are a couple of cities now that are having shortages of water and things like that. It might not affect us now, but there's a possibility that could happen. So just having all these ideas and principles when you're doing your design, reducing energy, Chris, it's in Chris's sector as well. There's this target to hit sort of decarbonization and sort of switch over the grid. But the only way to achieve that with renewables is to reduce the consumption that we have at the moment. So, engineers like Chris do a great job in trying to calculate how we can reduce the energy consumption around it. So that's what we embed in our practice: collaboration, trying to sort of work with as many people as possible. I think one of the issues we sort of have with engineering, we kind of feel if your title is engineer, you're part of this family, but it's such a wider aspect, working with planners, working with architects, and working with everybody else. And that's why we try to have something a bit more integrated.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's a really helpful insights. And Vepka, as you've kind of explored this in your own in the kind of PhD, but also kind of a long career of looking at global responsibility. What's kind of surprised you along the way of kind of that learning experience?
Ooh. I want to answer a different question, if that's okay, because I want to take us. I'll put on my PhD hat, but because I want to take us back to the definition of responsibility once more. And to me, I think responsibility is inherently relational. So you're never responsible in a vacuum. You're always responsible for somebody or something. And so in that sense, if we start looking at responsibility as relational, then the core question really comes, who is responsible for whom? And I think that's important if we start looking at global responsibility, because I think it's worth questioning if it's even possible for us to be responsible. Is it possible, is it wise for us to want to be responsible for the globe? Or is it sometimes much wiser to be responsible for what's local, for example? And so the relational aspect for me exists then on two levels. It exists on being responsible for others and knowing who I'm responsible. It also exists in relation to myself, so being aware of the consequences of my actions. And I think the EWBUK framework, like with that being aware of the consequences of actions is really important, because I think to me, there's a difference between awareness of consequences and then making a choice of a particular action. And I think the choice you can later judge differently. But if you're not aware, then you're operating in a space of, I guess, of ill-found judgment. So those are kind of the two aspects that I wanted to highlight, is that responsibility is relational. That the question of who you are responsible for matters. And that it is a lot about the awareness of the consequences of the actions. The choice to me then becomes separate. And just one follow-on thought is, I think the same as we have to think about, if we say it's about meeting the needs of all people, there's a part that's missing. It's who is meeting the needs of whom. And again, why does it matter? It matters because South Africa, where there's home, there's a 70% youth unemployment rate. So 70% of young people have no means of making an income. Now I'm working in a discipline that is all about automation. And you have to ask yourself, is any form of automation responsible in a world where most of the young people going into that world have no means of making money? So I think we need to put the people into responsibility in order to be able to really think about it holistically.
Thanks, Femke. And I can see the rest of our panel is really nodding along there. Is there any kind of additional thoughts you want to throw in?
Yeah, I really like the way Vibke's sort of framed that, sort of analysing the question, going back to basics and actually picking each word out of that definition and trying to work out what it means. And I think just to try and add to that, responsibility is not necessarily like sole accountability. I think when people say you're responsible for something, it seems like it's a burden. You're really just presented with a series of choices and realities that you can choose which one was going to have the biggest impact on. That's not necessarily almost picking up what Jonathan said. There's so many different industries all working together in any particular field, even building services. There's a whole load of architects and different engineers that get involved in the decision making, and not one of you is sort of solely accountable for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's something on like what you're actually being accountable for is kind of what you're responsible for in your own role, not perhaps the entirety of your engineering project. And I know, Muaz, when we were kind of first talking about this conversation, you reflected on some of the decisions you've made on your career path, and kind of reflecting that the motivations for kind of studying what you've studied and the research. Would you be able to share that kind of thinking that you went through?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So I'm from Pakistan, where that country is faced with many challenges. Many of them are environmental in nature, but there are also economic and social challenges to consider. So that informed a lot of what I wanted to do. And so really, I think that thinking about global responsibility, it's not something that I had thought about when I was younger. It's just I just thought that it just seemed like, to me, the right thing to do was to try to tackle problems that were quite global in nature, that had a large impact, a large positive impact. So for instance, you might think of methane emissions right now. There's a UN report I think they released, but this is going back a few years when I was started wanting to do my PhD, which was to try to reduce methane emissions from landfills. So a very small aspect of it, but I was trying to address that. And I had a big trouble in trying to just get funding, because a lot of funding is tied to where you're born. And so I thought that was a big challenge, even though you're trying to address something that's quite global in nature. It was still tied to, where I come from. So that I found that very challenging. So the pots of money that were available to me to try to grab those and make and turn them into something quite positive, I found that very challenging. But luckily, there's an organization in the United States that gives out awards based, on just the work rather than where you're born. So that was pretty good. The second one, I think, is obviously the projects that I'm involved in right now are again global in the nature. For instance, I'll give you an example of Catalyst, where we are working. So there's a Ha Long Bay in Vietnam, just unfortunately the water is quite polluted when it comes to eutrophication because of, as you were talking earlier, the nitrogen and phosphorus flows. And so we are trying to help researchers in Vietnam from the local university to try to solve that problem. So we are working with obviously engineers. There's engineers working on it. There's bioscientists working on it. There's social scientists working on it to try to understand the people's behaviors, agricultural practices. So that way, it sounds like we are not, it's a it's almost known as parachuting somewhere, where you just come in, do the work, and then you move away, where you haven't invested into the local population and the local skills. So instead of informing the researchers of what to do, where we needed, offering our expertise and working collaboratively, and not just with engineers, because it's not an engineering problem only. It's a very multidisciplinary problem. So we're trying to approach that in those ways. Those are the decisions that I'm making. And going forwards, I'm trying to get involved in things that have a global impact again, and not just the UK one, which is not easy, because a lot of the UK funding is focused on national impact. You might have seen the MPs were voting the other day on foreign aid, which was very relevant to us, because we are funded. Our Vietnamese project is funded through that aid. Unfortunately, it's still cut. And also doing where the field that perhaps Wiebke and I are from, a lot of the traditional academic outputs consist of journal papers or conferences, which are not the easiest to translate into real world change. So I'm trying to think of outputs that are directly informing some communities. So for example, in this Catalyst project, we are working with the government. So we're trying to put a website, and because our social scientists found that many people may not even be aware of the problem or the extent of it. So there's a resource and educational aspect of that. So we're trying to not just focus on traditional academic outputs, but also think about other ways that we can inform change as well. So those are some points for me on that question.
Thanks. So it's like thinking about what work you're getting involved in, but also those challenges of actually sometimes you don't have such control over that the kind of decision making. Does anybody else have kind of similar challenges where it's external factors that kind of restrict you, whether it being funding, the client? Any other examples of those kind of challenges? Jonathan?
Yeah, I had a couple. I just wanted to touch on briefly what Moaz was saying about technology transfer, because I did a couple of projects in Nigeria as well, and it's very similar, I assume, in Pakistan, where you have sort of international companies coming in to do most of the sort of public infrastructure works, bidding and winning contracts like that, just because there's almost this assumption that there's no local expertise to deliver it. But even when they do deliver it, they ship the entire labor and all over, everything is done. Then they kind of leave, and they've left an asset that can't really be maintained because there was nobody locally involved with the build of it. And that just creates so much maintenance issues later on and things like that. So it's part of that responsible engineering aspect to be able to go somewhere and make sure that everybody you integrated with the locals to ensure that they really understand what's going on so that they can then take over, not only maintain that asset well, but try to develop and grow that expertise to create more assets and better infrastructure along the line. For us in our practice, I think the biggest issue we sort of have with battling sort of like, this is a better way to build a home, but this is the budget or the final cost that a client has. And because we're in an industry that's driven by price, there's always that issue that you kind of, the client's always right, you know, that, oh yeah, okay, he just wants to dump concrete in the ground, let's go with that. But I think this is where we have an opportunity sort of as engineers to say, or at least create that awareness to say like, this is actually the right way to do it. These are better ways of doing it. And one of the challenges we face is we're not just pushing out, let's do the right thing, but we're actually pushing out, let's do the right thing that's affordable as well, because there are a lot of solutions out there, and some of them it's just easy to just pick and say, oh, let's use that solution. But it's about trying to cater a solution or a variety of solutions to meet the client brief and the budget as well. So I think we have that responsibility to try to find the solution that works, that is less detrimental to the environment as well.
And seeing some nods from our rest of our panelists, have you got other kind of perspectives that resonate to the kind of comments Jonathan's just shared?
I think if we're speaking about globally responsible engineering and we're making the assumption that we are operating in other countries, then I think this question of technology transfer and who designs what for whom is really important. And I think to me, there are probably two fundamentals that are, if you are sitting in a developed country, the first questions to ask is maybe to check your profits and check your consumption, because that is most likely where irresponsibility starts creeping in. And if kind of profits aren't shared and consumption is imbalanced, it's probably a good red flag. But what I wanted to add on the technology transfer side, so I wanted to give a bit of a case study, just because sometimes there's also this perception that technology transfer, like that the problems only come downstream with asset maintenance and so on, but the process of engineering itself was responsible. And I call it one of the beautiful dramatic failure story in South Africa has been the installation of solar geysers, so as hot water systems. Many of them funded with international development aid, designed by, won't name the particular country that was responsible for this particular failure, but the result of it is that basically the system was taken from that country, put directly into South Africa. The installation manual wasn't changed, and all the PV panels face south instead of north. And so the consequence of that is that there are thousands of people who have failed water heating systems. So to me that is a beautiful example of something that would have been intended to maybe be globally responsible engineering, because it dealt with environment, it dealt with renewables resources, it dealt with helping a developing country, but it was done absolutely irresponsibly, because that is lack of awareness about the decisions you should have made about them in the design process. So yeah, I guess it was just to bring a small failure case into the conversation.
Thank you. I can see we've got a comment from Mike Cook here on the chat. And Mike says, I've seen so many cases where engineers have done more harm than good, trying to satisfy one need for one group, and they make lives worse for many others. Did they think about the wider consequences? Do they care? Were they just following orders? And I think this that kind of example you provided there, Vebke, kind of starts to unpick some of that comment that Mike has shared. So please do keep sharing comments. It's great to hear your thoughts. Chris, kind of thinking about your work and kind of the responsibility that you have in your work, are there things, kind of going back to that accountability question, how do you approach that? How do you kind of approach conversations where perhaps you're kind of trying to lead a client or a project down a certain way, and you're kind of getting that pushback? It's a big question, but how do you kind of deal with that?
Yeah, I suppose I bring more of a UK focused. I don't have lots of recent sort of international project examples, but at least in the UK, as Jonathan said, it's very money driven. Not unfortunately, because that is a good thing, because the client wants value for money at the end of the day. But I think you don't necessarily, going back to the idea of perspective, you take a step back and you're not just focused on the client's needs. There's a service, a structure, a building that's going to have to function for the users for the foreseeable future and the duration of the project, and afterwards. And I think my personal example, lots of building services, stuff like heating and hot water, the cheapest solution to implement in terms of capital cost is not necessarily the cheapest operationally. So you might end up putting in a gas boiler system, which I've seen happen a lot recently, even though we're talking about trying to phase out fossil fuels and become net zero. Big high-rise blocks of flats and conversions from office to resi are becoming more and more prevalent as people work from home and want bigger spaces and want to move out. There's lots of residential projects coming up and people are just whacking in the cheapest one that they can, not thinking that maybe in 20 years from now, all these gas boilers, and it's going to be really difficult to convert it to heat pumps or electric or whatever is the fuel of choice then, because gas is going to have gone through the roof probably, and it's going to be really dirty and heavily taxed, or even just risen in price just because no one wants it anymore. And it's how we then convert the buildings back afterwards. So there's not really, you might be in for a quick dime now. And I think it's about making the client aware of that. Some clients will just never be able to convince them because they are just investors who want to come in, make a buck and then leave. But for the clients who want to stick around and might be profiting from it in the future, you want to try and think about presenting that option to them in a holistic way. So trying to do a carbon report on where the carbon emission is going to be and give an option saying this is how much lower it could be, or energy costs, well, it might save you now over the course of the project. The users are going to pay a hell of a lot more for this type of fuel. And what we found on a couple of projects is selling to the client to become a energy provider. So they actually, unfortunately, there's no legislation or rules or building regs to sort of control that operational versus capital cost. If the client wants to put in a really cheap building and leave, then there's nothing stopping them doing that. But trying to incentivize them by saying, if you keep this building, become an energy provider, you can charge your tenants, recoup the money that you've invested on a more expensive air source heat pump system or ground source heat pump system, and then actually make back your money and make a profit while also reducing your carbon emissions and the users getting a system that's future-proofed. So that's a couple of examples where we've tried to do that, and it's been quite successful.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the examples. It sounds like you've been trialing a few different approaches to be able to kind of get that switch on moment with your clients, to just try and get that awareness that it's not just about the bottom line that we want to focus on. Jonathan, I wonder with your work if you have similar experiences where you're kind of coming up against similar challenges.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think Chris kind of nailed it, because I was going to actually, my comment was going to be the challenge is quantifying the benefits of the system, right? So I work with a lot of developers, and it's really, I think the hardest thing I have is to sell the idea that, because they're only thinking of that initial capital cost, because they're not actually interested in the long-term benefits. So the conversation we're sort of having is not only will our home owners more aware now and are willing to spend for a sustainable home, which will allow you to have a premium. And it sort of just drives, it's not just about, low energy, it's about the building quality, building it well, building it properly, so that you have less maintenance issues in the long run, so that the asset can last longer, and so that when you pass on that benefit of this home, that it can save more money, and you can quantify that to someone who's willing to purchase that, they're willing to spend it. So I think that's I think that's one of the big issues that we have here, is trying to quantify that benefit, because someone turns around and says to you, why would I spend 20% more on that initial capital cost? And you just go, yeah, but it's 80% of savings on the operating cost during the design life of the building. And it's just trying to sort of match that, and that's what we have. And with homeowners, it's an easier conversation, because they plan on I'm spending this money, I'm going to be here for, say, however long, and it's an asset that I'll pass on to my children. So it's an easier conversation to have with them, but there's that justification on cost now. It's about quantifying, yes, you will spend this much more initially, but this is what you're going to save. And that's where we collaborate and work a lot with sort of, you know, energy consultants, energy assessors, and building services engineers to help us quantify that savings.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks again for sharing some success stories of being able to reframe the kind of thinking. We've got a question come through that is from Maxwell, who has asked if anybody has any thoughts on how we can have these kind of conversations from the kind of contracting viewpoint. So rather than that client designer, if there's other perspectives that people have experience in.
Yeah, okay, so we work with a lot of contractors in selling the idea. And I think what we're trying to do is a joint responsibility between client, designer, and contractor. So there are a couple of contractors we work with, and they are more receptive to the discussions around, let's try a better way of doing things. You know, they're more engaged, they're more switched on. And what sort of that provides for them is, with that better layer of responsibility, they're finding out different methods of building, and they're now able to apply that to the different types of projects that they have. So in a sense, what's happening is, due to that added responsibility, that knowledge is being created, and they almost have a designer perspective when they go for it. And on the other hand of things, you have other contractors who will tell you, this is how we've been doing it for the longest time. We're not going to change it. We're going to stick with these ways. But you can see that that because everybody's becoming more aware, that's changing. So they're getting less work and doing less because they're not. There's not that ability to adapt. And after the pandemic and after Brexit, the businesses that are surviving are those that are adapting. So this is the perspective with the contractors we have. There are a lot of them that we're working with, and we're saying, try this, why don't we do this? Let's almost work together, because as a designer, my responsibility is to make sure you the contractor, can deliver it from a sustainability point of view, from a risk point of view, from a financial point of view as well. So there's that sort of back and forth, with I coming with a solution, you going, this is actually a better one because I can bring the concrete in here, then I can do that, and then we're both coming to a solution. So there's definitely a lot of responsibility that contractors can bring onto the table. In fact, the biggest amount of responsibility will actually come from the construction side and the delivery side of the project.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for unpacking that one for us. So kind of stepping a step back from the kind of examples we've been talking about, one of the other elements of the responsible principle is that ability to facilitate conversations and inspire others along the journey. Does anybody have an example of where they've been, where they've needed to have those kind of tricky conversations, either with colleagues or peers, where, you know, responsibility isn't on the agenda and you're having to kind of bring that perspective? So kind of rather than the client perspective. Okay.
I can share a small story, but it's a small story, it's quite complex maybe in nature. And that was that 2 years ago I released South Africa's first residential electricity consumption data set, which effectively is the most comprehensive study done on domestic energy use on the African continent. In particular, it spans 20 years of household surveys and electricity consumption meters, so it's super detailed. And that study was done to shape to inform the right sizing of the electrification of South Africa's electricity grid. So the study at the point in time where I got involved, the last time that data had been collected was about 4 or 5 years ago. And so in many ways, so there are a couple of complications. The one is that the electricity utility is a national key point. So by definition, they just never ever release any data. And then there were real commercial questions around it that they had of saying, if we release this data, then how, like, what if somebody else comes and steals our business? So is there kind of a commercial risk? But there also the people that involved were scared, I guess, that if they release the data, is that potentially going to affect their position and their jobs? So that was, I guess, the one side of it. And I think all of those concerns in a different scenario could have been very real. So I think there is, like, if data is commercially sensitive, if there are significant risks to assets or humans, like, we do need to think really carefully about it. But again, in this scenario, actually a lot had changed over the last 5 years. So the risks associated with the data set were different. On the flip side, though, there were other risks. And the other risks were, for example, that the data was still being shared, but it was being shared informally by passing a hard drive like from one person to another. Let's say researchers taking that hard drive, using the data, working on it, and it just being passed around. But it had sensitive customer information. It had IDs, it had phone numbers, it had addresses, it had names, it had income, etc. And so that was really a journey of taking people that had one view of responsibility based on the risk that they perceive, and taking them on a journey to help them to understand that there's actually a greater and maybe more real risk to which they also ought to have a responsibility. So that was effectively maybe coming to this, like, to the inspiring and conversations. It was like a series of very gentle and slow conversations over a year and a half, not always by myself, sometimes being able to get other experts in and like presenting a view from their perspective, being able to be patient, being able to go backward and forward, and minute decisions made in meetings, so that sometimes once we had made a step forward, that we wouldn't go backward anymore. But it just made me, so even in a small decision like that, made me realize that if a group of people that you're working with has a particular paradigm under which they've worked for 30, 40 years, it can be very difficult to adapt that and create an understanding that responsibility now means something different.
So that kind of very gentle, slow approach of just bringing people up to the kind of same knowledge and understanding. Yeah.
Herding cats, that's how I sometimes felt it.
Herding cats. Excellent. And Muaz, I know when we were talking the other week, you kind of had that experience, but from the other perspective, where your colleagues were sharing something and you kind of had that kind of light bulb moment. Would you be able to share a little bit of kind of that from the reverse, and kind of receiving that inspiration?
Yes. So I think, are you talking about the quinoa example? Yes. Yeah. So I was just on a course with an organization that give you some information and teach you a little bit about carbon literacy. And obviously, we maybe many of us are aware now of the carbon cost of a lot of meat consumption around the world, and the planet probably cannot support everyone eating meat. So obviously, other alternatives such as quinoa is one of them. But one of my colleagues shared that actually it's not just switching to something that might look like it's a better alternative, but actually the way that it is produced is just so harmful to the local communities, where you are just I don't want to dart away from it, but it's just that there is a paradigm shift of, for instance, that this particular quinoa around in that particular region was being produced really unsustainably. So then you start to wonder, actually, are people supporting these practices thinking that, and they're actually having the opposite effect? So it makes you wonder if the paradigm shift, as we Jonathan have touched up on, that do we need that right now? Because as we know, we need to curb emissions quite drastically by a very short deadline. It seems like we have ignored it, and all of a sudden we need to really quickly do something about it. So I wonder if things such as capitalism, where you mine this one particular resource over and over again in one particular place or everywhere, to the extent that it is just no more, and then you move on to the next thing, is that the best way to do it? So when we are moving forwards, thinking about carbon taxes, thinking about moving away from meat consumption, alternative products, we need to think about how we resource them. We need to think about the very long term. For instance, once we are maybe out of this rut of the deadline of climate and curbing the emissions, thinking about how to support this population that is growing and also that's existing. By 2050, we'll have most of the infrastructure in many parts of the world already exists. So we need to think about sustainable ways of maintaining these quite carbon heavy materials that we have already. So it's concrete, I mean, the carbon emissions around the world. So that's really, I think, one of my light bulb moments was that quinoa, that, you know, not just taking something for face value and thinking about how it's being produced and transported along the chain. Thinking about, for instance, the cost of buying a t-shirt is something I learned quite recently as well, when the football clubs changed. Because where I'm from, Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, we produce a lot of cotton t-shirts for the rest of the world. So thinking about that cost, the amount of fresh water that it uses, the amount of transportation costs, and the long-term life cycle of one t-shirt, because you have to wash it again and again in the car and the washing machines that we have. Should we be buying these clothes? Is there a better way to produce them? So really thinking about, I think, a lot of the personal things that affect us in our lives is also, I think, something to consider. Because we're not just engineers, we're also people who have families, who have friends, and we do things, we go on holiday. So really, that's something that I could add to that.
Thanks for sharing. It's really interesting to hear that this one small conversation about, you know, just looking at one product, quinoa, and kind of the impact of that, how that for you sparked off this, okay, let me start looking at the other impacts that I'm involved in, that my work is involved in. And it just shows, you know, from Vedprit's example of being on the other side, being that person that wants to highlight an issue, and then from Muaz being the person who's received that, just the power of these conversations that we can have, and the power of being able to, you know, just sharing knowledge and sharing information, and just allowing us all to kind of reflect on that. So thank you both for sharing that. That's really helpful. We've got about 5 minutes left before we go into some breakout spaces with everybody to kind of explore this individually in our own kind of own practices. So in this last final 5 minutes, is there anything that you want to just make sure we put on the table? Any kind of final thoughts, anything that you haven't been able to share so far? So over to our panelists for any other additional comments.
That's sort of something I wanted to talk about. I mean, now I very much work in the UK sort of building services construction scene, having previously worked in development for a short stint. And I think the key thing is there is so much overlap between the two, between anything. I'm sure you could go between any two disciplines and find some sort of useful thing. But the thing that really sort of hammered that home was reviewing the design, the student design challenges for the EWB on a few of them. You know, trying to get the students to think an improved cook stove, for example. You know, who's using that, why? You know, there's lots of things that you need to think about when you're trying to design an improved cook stove or implement it in a project. You know, where are they getting the fuel from? Is that really the best fuel? Is taking the hit and doing LPG maybe better for the people who are using it? And how can we reduce deforestation as well as climate change while still meeting the user's needs? And it's really the exact same questions that you apply, at least in my job in building services. You know, who's using the building? How can we reduce their fuel consumption to stop climate change? You know, what's the best design solution for that installation? It's just the exact same questions, but just in a completely different context. And trying to find those commonalities. We're not, as engineers, we're not just coming at different problems, and you don't need to be an expert in that one particular field to be able to tackle it. Sometimes a fresh perspective is better, and you just by asking the same questions in different projects, you come up with very similar solutions.
Can I jump in? I'll let it be my concluding words, and just I'll make it a question that's been inspired by some of the comments that I've been reading in the chat. So especially the ones around legislation and regulations. And so kind of when I entered this conversation, I viewed responsibility as an attribute of engineers. So that was kind of the paradigm with which I entered. And like in the course of the conversation, I've started thinking, what if globally responsible engineering is not actually an attribute, or responsibility is not an attribute of engineers, but it's actually also an outcome that we're trying to achieve. And then the question that follows from that is saying, so if we're trying to achieve globally responsible engineering, what are the skills that are required in order to be able to do that? And so again, how does that tie with legislation? As I'm thinking back to some experiences that I've had arguing with friends who are coming from a legislative and sometimes the social perspectives, where again, so kind of like it was a scenario around a water crisis happening in South Africa, where my view was one of, but engineers have told you for 10 years, this is going to happen if you don't change. And you haven't changed. So the fact that people are dying now and getting sick is what was going to happen. And my view was very much one of, look, like somewhere along the line, you have to learn to listen to engineers. And her view was, you're an engineer, you've got to solve this crisis. And I think that's something that the engineering industry globally hasn't really yet figured out how to do. So if we want to achieve globally responsible engineering, what are the kind of skills that I need to learn so that I can have those conversations that sway things on a legislative, political, regulatory space? And I know that Engineers Without Borders UK has done a lot in terms of engineering education and skills and so on. But I think that is a question that we really have to ask ourselves is, do we currently have the skills, the non-technical skills to be globally, to achieve globally responsible engineering?
Thank you, Wiebke. Fantastic final thoughts from you. Thank you very much. Jonathan and Muaz, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it all ties up, because I think to follow on to Wiebke, what are the values that we need, right? I think global empathy and just, it ties back to the rest of the values, you know, that you guys are putting forward, regenerative, purposeful, inclusive, because it's only when we open ourselves up to other ideas that we start seeing how we can implement solutions and stuff like that. And I almost wonder, because I was a reviewer for the design challenge that the Engineers Without Borders had, and it was just amazing to see so many ideas come in, but the better ideas were the ones that necessarily didn't just take an idea or a better way of doing something in the UK and put it, for example, in where the challenge was. It was actually those that actually understood what the people went through. They put themselves in the shoes of the user and the people there, and almost had this sort of open-minded perspective to, right, I'm in a new place, like almost being stuck on a desert island. I've got a coconut and I've got this. Now, what can I use to come up with a solution, rather than, you know, oh, this has worked in the UK before, I'm just going to take this recycling plant, bam, and put it there, because there's so many different. But then how do we as engineers now create that for the younger ones, right? How do we, for these uni students, and this is, I think this is where the Engineers Without Borders, not only are you doing sort of courses to create awareness about the global challenges and the issues on the long-term supply chain, but now how do we tap into the other engineering firms and make sure that that sort of thinking is inbuilt in their training and their CPDs and things like that. And just by creating that sort of awareness, it naturally will tie into global responsibility.
Thanks, Jonathan. Muaz, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think I very much agree with the rest of the panelists on their final thoughts. I think that collaboration and having those skills to be able to inform that change is really important. As you know, the others have also found that we could be saying something for a while, but if it's not in the legislation, why would, you know, no one is bound to it. So I think really working on that, and as Jonathan was saying about university students, so I'm not an academic yet, but that is you know, on my ambition. So when if I'm able to achieve that, then that's something I would like to do, to be able to introduce the modules in which I'm involved, to try to introduce global responsibility, the other principles, and really get them and the students to think about the problem, not just from a technical point of view. That's the big part of the course, and rightly so, but also to think about the people that are going to be using their facilities and design or whatever the problem is for a very long time, and doing it in a better way, informed by the locals, and much like the design challenges put forward. There was great information from the people that were already there, the way they were making their livings, their day-to-day lives, some of the people in the local council. So I think trying to implement those into our universities so that students are getting that idea early on, and obviously where the firms are already established, to try to engage with them and really make it sort of clear that these are some things that, you know, would probably benefit everyone. I mean, there is research out there that when you start to engage with communities quite early on in the design process. It facilitates adoption of new technology because you are familiar with the things that will hurdle it later on, so you can mitigate them much early. So really those kinds of things to think about, as Jonathan and Wiebke pointed out, ethics, and having that empathy globally as well as within your communities, and obviously investing in the areas where we do our work.
Thanks, Boaz. I have some really helpful, tangible examples again from all of our panelists on how to kind of start making these steps in your work. At this point, what we're going to be doing is thanking our panelists for their contribution to the conversation. Really just starting to kind of get that inspiration and that kind of different examples going through our minds, and I invite you all to join a small breakout discussion now, just to unpack that a little bit further and discuss what that could mean in your own workplace, in your own projects that you're involved in, if you're able to stick around for the next half an hour. But I hope you can join me now in thanking all of our panelists for their contributions.